Good evening, brothers and sisters. My name is Father Matt Malone. I'm the president and editor-in-chief of American Media, which has been the publisher of American Magazine since 1909, the weekly magazine published by the Jesuits of the United States and Canada. And it is my great pleasure, as one of the co-sponsors of this event, and also as a trustee of Boston College, to welcome you here to this event. If any of you have ever seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, then you'll know that at the beginning, Harrison Ford is running from a bunch of people who are trying to kill him in order to get to a plane and to escape the crowd. And that is essentially the experience I just had at LaGuardia Airport. So if I seem a little winded or distracted or out of uniform, you can blame it on the mimetic crisis that is LaGuardia Airport. But indeed, it's a great pleasure to be with you. And I would like to thank Boston College for hosting us this evening, and also thank our co-sponsors, the Remus Project, which is a project dedicated to the study of René Girard's thought at Heathrow College that myself and Sheelah were pleased to be a part of helping to found, along with principally Dr. Michael Kerwin, and also Imitation, which has helped to underwrite much of these proceedings. My task here tonight is simply to kick things off, but I would like to say that, you know, for me personally, as a student of René Girard, this is a project that's very close to my heart. And inasmuch as the pages of America are dedicated to finding ways to bear witness to the gospel, to resolve conflict, and to bridge divides across generations, across race, across gender, across sexual orientation, we take a great interest in this work, which I think provides us with a radically old and new way of looking at the world. Just a word about the folks we will hear from tonight. We'll first hear from Dr. Duncan Morrow, who holds degrees from the University of Oxford and the University of Edinburgh and the University of Ulster. He is currently the Director of Community Engagement at the University of Ulster, responsible for developing the university's partnerships with groups and organizations across the community. He's also a lecturer in politics. He has served as the Chief Executive of the Community Relations Council, where he championed the concept of a shared future and developed the Council's role in research and active learning in policy development. He has also been appointed as Chairman of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on tackling sectarianism not in the Scottish government, but on behalf of the Scottish government, or perhaps within the Scottish government. And he is the co-author of On the Way of Freedom, for which René Girard wrote the introduction. We will then hear from James Alison, who is a Catholic theologian and a priest and author who earned his doctorate in theology from the Jesuit faculty in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. He has studied, lived, and worked in Mexico, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, and the United States, as well as his native England. A systematic theologian by training, James has developed Jesus, the Forgiving Victim, a program of induction into the Christian faith for adults, following on from the insight into desire associated with René Girard's thought. It's also a personal pleasure to welcome James here. I've known him for nearly 20 years, and I can say that from my point of view, he is one of the great theologians in the English-speaking world today. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Sheelah Hidden, who is a research associate at Heathrow College, and also a dear friend, and who really deserves much of the credit for organizing this symposium. Not only this one, but the one we had last night in New York at the Union Theological Seminary, and the one that we will have coming up later in Chicago, is it?
Holland, Michigan.
Holland, Michigan, right. It's somewhere west of 10th Avenue. So, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Sheelah.
I think I speak for all of us when I say that we are absolutely delighted to be here. It's such a beautiful place and very pleased to see you all here. I personally would like to thank the marvelous and generous staff of Boston College who helped me put this together. It's wonderful to be able to speak about this burning topic in these beautiful surroundings. Now, our program this evening will be that each speaker will speak for about 20 minutes. We're only actually going to give you a taste because we want you to work. At the end of which we will open the floor to questions and hopefully an animated discussion. Duncan will begin to speak, and he will first of all explore the key insights of the work and thinking of René Girard and indicate to us how this formed his experience in the Troubles in Northern Ireland and his work there. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It is really wonderful to be here. I'm amazed that you all came out to see me, and then I realised you didn't come out to see me because you came out to see James. This is one of these buy one, get one free. But every now and again you want a little bit more, and a little bit more. Thank you very much also for organising this. For me, this is an opportunity to come here and just share a few things about things which have been very important to me. The work of René Girard, in a sense, upended our whole approach in the community that I lived in, which was an ecumenical Christian community, as to who we were and what we were about and what peace might actually mean. And I suppose I've, working on this stuff, felt this is really important. This not just upends a kind of theoretical conflict analysis. This upends, for me anyway, and I speak for myself, my understanding of myself and of my relationships and of where I actually am in the world, and also of what might actually make for any change in the world, what change might actually mean. So this is an opportunity for me to talk about something which has been hugely important, and I hope that in engaging you with it, you'll find also that the work of Girard has something to say, really, to us all in the modern world. The language of Girardianism is sometimes a little opaque, like all kind of academic theories. And one of the core words he uses is mimesis. Now, what my explanation of what he's getting at there is, of course, it has to do with mimicry and copying. You will see an imitation. But in some ways, that's a little bit diversionary. Because I think when we think we're mimicking somebody or imitating something, we do something conscious. Mimesis is getting at something deeper than that. It says that before we are even aware of it, we are learning from each other, we are changing in relation to each other, we are reacting and becoming different in relation to each other. In other words, it's not true that we're fixed and finally made like some kind of automobile, some kind of car. We're actually constantly in shifting relationships with others around us, and those relationships matter. The quality of those relationships, whether those are traumatic relationships with great negative consequences for people, or whether they're relationships where people learn something new and a new possibility of their lives, they are crucially important for who we are and who we become. And that the focus shifts from who am I to how are we relating to each other? In what way is what I do a response to what you're doing, and in what way is what is happening to you a response to what I'm doing? And that we are, in some deep sense, interrelated. And this insight, I suppose, he called mimesis. We are mimetic long before we're conscious, and I'm going to read a few things here, so I apologise if it sometimes goes down. But this mimicry of others, this reaction, both positive and negative, is so deep, so foundational, that we should speak of it less as conscious copying or mimicry than as a kind of magnetic relationship with each other. It goes back and forward between us, or gravity. It's something that pre-exists. And Girard's job, I think, has been to kind of raise it to our attention, to reveal it, as opposed to invent it. And so the substantial case for Girard, at some level or other, rests on the truth of this proposition, that we are related with each other, and that what happens to us all, in some ways, also depends on what each of us is in the middle of those relationships. Girard's additional aspect of this was to say it's not just copying like learning, like children do when they learn how to walk, or when they learn how to talk, or when they learn how to do things as they develop. It's actually that to extend it to desiring. We learn what it is to be a boy, a girl, a human being from those around us. We learn what it is culturally. We learn what it is that's important. He said this is the mimesis of desire. We actually copy or mimic those things. We don't come into the world knowing that we want to be a fireman, or we have to want a washing machine, or we're going to be a great singer. At some level or other, we acquire our desires in relation to all that's around us, most profoundly from those closest to us. And those may change from time to time, but very deeply from those at the beginning. For Girard, mimesis of desire is therefore a dynamic reality at the centre of who we are as human beings. While this is a matter of simply adopting or adapting for our models, it looks like learning. But what Girard also discovered was that mimetic desire is also at the heart of our conflicts. Because if I learn to desire what you have or what you want, you learn it's very important and you desire it more. Because you desire it more, I desire it more. And potentially, if we haven't got ways to distribute that, we come into more and more conflict over the objects, which in turn may actually turn into less about the thing we first desire, but me getting rid of you because you're the obstacle in my way. So, quickly desire pulls us into relationships where not simply learners with each other, but potentially rivals. And the more we are in that kind of mimetic relationship with each other, the greater the risk of conflict. The greater then, potentially, that conflict will escalate into violence, in escalating patterns of revenge and act and counteract. At a small level, we can see this where, for example, two children are sitting in a room filled with toys and they only want one. That's the classic example, where one child picks up a toy and there are 300 in the room and the other one only wants that toy. We all know it at one level, a banal example, but actually, we try to use desire all the time in our world. How do you think the advertising industry works? By telling you that you will be a better person if you buy that soap powder. I too could become like Brad Pitt. I could. Or Beyonce, actually.
I've always suspected.
Well, we're working on it. But we also even try to use it in a positive sense, of course, through role modelling. The whole point of role modelling is to set somebody up and encourage emulation. So, for the good or the bad, this mimetic reality, this knowing that actually bringing somebody into contact with something else will give them possibilities of change, is deep within our culture. Deep within our culture. The problem, of course, is if desires of this sort are uncontrolled. What if relationships between adults, between groups of adults, have the same tendency to converge on the same object as the two children in the room? What if the desire of one escalates the desire of the other until both parties converge together in a spiral of reciprocal obsession? All of a sudden, uncontrolled mimetic desires transform from learning into conflict, setting off a pattern of tit for tat and potentially very dangerous. Girard postulates that mimetic relationships, therefore, have two realities. They are part of who we are. This is not a question of being able to escape mimetic rivalry any more than mimesis, should I say, any more than we can escape gravity. This is part of who we are. And at the same time, precisely because of it, there's an enormous risk that we're pulled into these escalating conflicts, with huge risks for ourselves, but also as these escalate for the whole of humanity as it's dragged into this kind of conflict. Perhaps now you're beginning to see why Girard's insights matter, and at a certain level, why they're such a challenge to our thinking. They're a challenge at a number of levels, of course, because in some sense it says to something which contradicts much of what we have developed in the West, which is that relatedness is the defining reality of human experience. There is no human being outside of relationships. We are shaped, even in ways we don't know, by things which happened in long distant past to people who are long dead and are no longer known. We're each shaped differently by those things because none of us has a repetitious life. We all have different forms and shapes carried on to us. So we're all unique. That's different from saying we're all individual, all on our own. So, at some level or other, who we are depends on who and how we are related. And the question about change is therefore, with whom am I in a relationship, and how does that change, and what is the content of that? So our questions about human persons, in some sense, not so much a question of, about change is not so much a question of agreements, structures, and policy, but as the gospel has it, a radical change in our relationships, a metanoia, as it talks about, a turning around, a changing with whom we are thinking. Modernity, which gives us the impression that we are formed on our own, by ourselves, is in fact, for Girard and for me now, an illusion, with serious and potentially dangerous consequences. If we are formed in relationships and change in relationships, then the key question is, who do we follow and how are we shaped? The question is not so much who are we, but whose are we? And in a strange sense, we were talking about this last night, the modern Enlightenment debate is always about, is there a God or is there not a God? The Hebrew discussion was, who is your God? Is it this one or that one? Because there's no possibility of moving into a relationship in which you're not following something. So it's, in a sense, a return to that notion, which is we never escape that we are following or in relationship with something else. And the critical question is, with what and with whom are we in it? And that, in a sense, that which we are following is, in a deep sense, one of the definitions of what we mean with this word, which, of course, is always too small, about God. Who is it that is the central reality that is defining who we are? Or what is it? And it might be multiple. It might be multiple. So Girard is therefore a radical challenge to everything that our modern society tells us about self-realization, self-fulfillment, and forgiving ourselves. Girard returns us to a new beginning, in a sense, by denying that human autonomy is the core. Everything and everyone depends on their very being for relationships. So Girard returns us to the question of not only who am I, but how am I with others and how are others with me? If we wish change, what is it that would reveal change and make change possible also for others? Having identified the first foundational issue, relatedness and the human mimesis of desire, Girard's second question tackled the consequences of the first. If our desires converge into rivalry and obsession, that poses a really serious risk to all of us. How do we stop that happening, actually? His answer, established through a reading of literature and anthropology, was that human survival was made possible when something quite unforeseen happened, when the desires of all converged on a single target. And this convergence of desire has a double, if paradoxical, effect. Obviously, driving out the person or the target at the centre of their rivalry created a unanimity between everybody else. So he postulates that this is the way in which this happens. By actually scapegoating somebody else, all the rest of us end up actually not fighting each other. And the scapegoat has the miraculous consequence that he, it, she, they, take it away for the rest of us. That the way that we resolve our conflicts between each other is to push them out on somebody else. Because the desires of all converged against one, there was no more rivalry between those left. The consequences of all against one was the miraculous appearance of social peace. Of course, none of this was immediately conscious to the participants, but what they did know was that violence had been dramatically, miraculously transformed into peace through the agency of the mimetic frenzy directed against one. Furthermore, this transformation was so incredible that the victim must have been the one who brought peace. This devil who'd caused conflict was also God. But it was a God who potentially could ruin the community. It was a God against which the community had to protect itself as well as worship. Girard postulates that humanity became possible because of the enormity of the experience. From this experience, he postulates, comes actually our whole way of working together, that at the foundation of how we work together is actually an unspoken other who takes away for us the potential rivalry of our communities. This is a huge claim. Of course it's a huge claim. But essentially it says this, that the pattern, reading from all sorts of things, the pattern of rivalry is so potentially dangerous that the emergence of culture, the emergence of human religion, in fact, with all of its rituals and stories told from the side of the people who did the driving out, was critical to making human life possible. So this is a very large claim. I understand it's a very large claim. But it essentially says that actually we're living in a world in which we are related, in which we resolve our conflicts actually still by directing them on other people, by targeting them on other people. Now, you can think of lots of examples of this, but lots of family therapy talk about identified patients in the family. Lots of us get our small social peace out of gossiping with each other about a third party. In fact, to be honest with you, it's great fun. And at the same time, the potential is that they carry away for us our sense that we are the same as them. We are better than them. We get our own place through these processes, these are small versions of it, through our culture, in which all of us participate at some level in the lower levels, hopefully at the lower levels, of the actual expulsion of the victim. Because eventually this turns potentially very, very nasty. At its heart is a lie or the misapprehension. Social peace is bought at the cost of the sacrifice of a scapegoat. Our peace that we have together rests on violence. The good people, us, have our assurance of our goodness in and against the scapegoat. Human culture rests on a hypocrisy. And then the third part of Girard. There's the mimetics, the sense that we are related, the sense that this is both core to our humanity and at the same time a potential risk. The sense that this is really important, not just to us as individuals, but it's a formative and part of the way we think about culture. And then the third reality, which is this, and which is how do we begin to unveil any of this? Part of the scandal in modern academy of Girard appears to take place because of the scale of the claims of the hypothesis. But for me, the evidence of mimetic desire, of scapegoating, of buying our peace by projecting it on others is actually quite substantial once you start looking for it. In fact, it's overwhelming. The second part of the scandal appears to be Girard's discovery or assertion eventually that the vehicle for the revelation of the mechanism underlying culture has been the stone left, abandoned by the builders, the Judeo-Christian culture in which we participate, the Judeo-Christian scriptures. In his work, Girard explores the extent to which Jewish faith records the emergence of a people whose God was not based in violence, was not that of a crowd, but was one they found when they themselves were expelled. A mysterious God beyond the reach of violence and culture, and whose concern and whose love never dies for the victims. This intuition and experience, which requires them to go through a desert as they leave Egypt, is made visible through the Hebrew Bible as a constant to and fro, because it's not that they just get it. It's like you live with the reality of still being human beings who scapegoat people, and at the same time, you have a deep knowledge in the culture. This is not who we are. So the shape and form of the Old Testament in many ways is that toing and froing, that story of people who both know and don't know, who get it right, who get it wrong, who miraculously live with something that they know is important. For Girard, all of this reaches its central epiphany in the New Testament, and above all, and absolutely above all, in the person of Jesus. In Jesus, all of this becomes clear as the very notion that is probably so imbued in us, which is so absolutely strange, is that the central figure of Christianity is crucified as a criminal on a dung heap outside the city. That God is not some big man in the sky with a big stick telling people what to do, but is with his Son, crucified outside the city, offering forgiveness to us who are the people who are part of the driving out process. Revealing both what God really is, but also revealing back to us who we really are. And in a sense, in Girardian terms, revealing our participation in a culture whose peace has been bought by violence. It's a radical claim too, but Jesus takes the place of the scapegoat, the unique foundational victim on the cross, and offers us forgiveness and the possibility of a different kind of peace. Made visible above all, actually in the Eucharist, in which the words show God sacrificing himself for us rather than the other way around, in the faith in the resurrection and the life beyond this reality of the death proposed for by culture. In this regard, Girard regards himself as carrying forward a revolution in human affairs which has already been present, but has been subject to the to and froing of knowing and recognition and misrecognition now in the whole Christian world. That was the lot of the Jewish people in the Hebrew Bible. We too do this toing and froing. We know something, and we can't quite get away from the fact that we might know something about that the people who we are victimizing are also, we are part of that story. But the other way around, we still do it. We continue to do it. The alternative, the new possibility, is not, of course, to escape from mimesis, but now we have a new model with whom to be mimetic. The model who doesn't rival. The possibility out of our dependence on violence is not a romantic identification that we're now the good guys and they're the bad guys, although I have to say that's very deep in the history of Christianity, that we are now the good guys and they are the bad guys, with terrible consequences for many people, I have to say. But the gospel imperative is, follow me. And that following takes place in a world which is founded on the revelation of our complicity, but on the promise of forgiveness and the promise that if we do, we will be in the kingdom. I'm not going to go into this in detail now because that's partly James's part. But it is important to note that the call to follow Jesus, this call to follow Jesus, is a universal one. And it's distinctive from a violent process, which is we convert everybody to some sign up to Christianity in that very formal sense. So Jesus is both absolutely central to it. If we understand Christianity as meaning the call to conversion to the victim, it's absolutely central. If we understand it to mean that we have to get everybody to sign up and bash them because they're in the wrong camp, actually, paradoxically, we find ourselves misreading what Girard is about and turning it again into another potential weapon. So how we are Christian again is just as important as that we are Christian for me in this context. While Girard resolutely restores Jesus to the centre of human affairs, he does so in a way which is potentially as uncomfortable for Christianity and Christians as it is for everybody else. Okay, so I need to say something before I stop, and I've probably spoken too long, although James said that if I spoke too long, he'd be pressing me from behind going, keep speaking, keep speaking. Just a little bit about how this has been practically relevant in the situation where I live. I live in Northern Ireland, which in Boston College is a place which has a certain resonance. Certainly Boston College has a certain resonance in Northern Ireland. but in which we've become a kind of a byword for reciprocal violence, in which, in some way or other, out of our history, out of a post-colonial history, out of a Reformation and post-Reformation history, we've gone round and round in a circle in a way which essentially has placed people against each other. To call it a battle between Catholic and Protestant, or British and Irish, is not entirely wrong, but it's misleading if it distracts us from the central issue. Everybody is fighting, in fact, paradoxically, for peace and for justice, for freedom. All these big words. And the way to do that is by beating the others, the way to victory. We actually all agree on who the problem is. Them. There's a deep agreement. I can't do anything except that they change. One of the things, I was brought up in an ecumenical community, which at some level or other was quite unusual. It retained a space where people, I was talking to James about this earlier, almost in exile, came to try to find some space, some freedom to be slightly different, even to breathe only out of the reality that we lived in. And I think there was a significant risk before Girard that we set ourselves up as we're the good guys and all the rest of them are terrible. What Girard showed us was, actually, no, we're not. We belong just as much to these people, but we've been given something which we didn't know, which is we're constantly being given to see this from the side of the victims, and the victims keep moving in this community. The victims aren't one side or the other. It's not about good guys and bad guys. It is actually about, all the time I'm being asked to identify with people who actually are constantly shifting which side they're in, and trying to speak out of that reality. In recent years, the reciprocal violence of Northern Ireland became actually visible, and it became part of the public discussion. We're quite unusual in the sense that the word reconciliation, finding peace by reconciliation, became the great language of the Northern Ireland public political process. And in a way, the statement that that is necessary was remarkable. Essentially, it says, we must find a different way from simply driving out our opponent. We have to find a different way. But making it happen is more difficult. Because what reconciliation actually means is making a future with the very people who you regard or regarded as the devil. Making a future as brothers and sisters, the transformation of those people who've been the greatest risk to you and whom you have been the greatest risk, making a future together. So the statement from outside that reconciliation is a good thing is much easier to do than if what it says to you is you must make a future with those people who've been killing your family. So the journey from we must find a different future to how do we make that journey is much more difficult than simply stating the case as an academic proposition. Well, we could agree that violence itself was counterproductive. Actually, for a future, we need more than an absence of violence. If you do the peace-building theory and all of that, it's about not violence. It's not that. It's the presence of a new relationship. The core question is how do we move not to an absence of physical violence, but to the presence of a new relationship in which we relate to each other differently, no longer as enemies, but actually as broken people who did terrible things to each other and who now know we have to find a future together. That, for me, is the definition of what, in practical terms for us, it means to forgive. It's not a sentimental, it doesn't count anymore. It is, we have done terrible things. I was part of those terrible things. And we now must make a future together. That's actually what to forgive and be forgiven means. Far from being romantic, reconciliation is always a shocking apocalypse of both mercy and truth. What Girard brought to us was that we had to find ourselves not as the good guys, but as actually the participants in a process which had us, at least for those people who were our victims, as the bad guys. And that's hard to hear. That's hard to hear. The requirement, generosity, however, it is only generosity that shines a more penetrating and unbearable light on our complicity with violence and conflict. The requirement for mercy and the spotlight of unflinching truth mean that reconciliation hardly ever enters the world of the realistic, except when every other option is exhausted, as the last chance saloon and the salvation of the exhausted. What I want to say to you is, our resistance to the knowledge that we are complicit is so deep that it is only when, in my experience, it is almost the last word. And only when we know, as Jesus does for us, forgives us and offers us into a new world, that the possibility begins to emerge that we have a bridge. That we have a bridge. We are deeply resistant to this knowledge. This kind of peace is a far cry from the limited but manageable goal, equating peace with the absence of violence. It can't be enforced. It isn't even negotiated. It has to be risked and led. It requires people who take huge risks. The appearance of language of reconciliation in Northern Ireland reflected the truth that every other alternative to the death appeared to have been exhausted, and we are very lucky to have found it. And it is still resisted. All this takes me to two final points about Girard and about his work on revealing violence, which are of relevance, I hope, to everyone here. Many people comment that Girard is impractical, that he doesn't give you immediate solutions, that he can't be applied. On one level, if you're looking for a recipe that can be applied everywhere, the critics are right. This won't give you a formula, it won't give you a theory of international relations, and it won't give you instant doctrines of state. But at another level, I think they're totally wrong. In practice, what Girard reveals is this: peace is not just another social contract, a legal formula, or a structural solution. While these things have their place, they remain rooted in trying to protect us from the truth. The cry of hypocrisy, however, the knowledge that we belong to this, now makes this more and more difficult. And what Girard says is this: peace depends on the possibility of a new relationship. Peace now means a form of radical conversion, from the assumption that we're the good people, through the acceptance of our complicity and the possibility of forgiveness. And this is only opened up to us if we have some sense that that is a possible reality, and that possible reality is brought into the world by Jesus. Secondly and finally, Girard tells us that this has consequences. If this is right, this isn't just about Northern Ireland. Girard tells us that the consequence of the revelation of the scapegoat mechanism will be complicated, both because the declaration of the new world and the removal of our prime, and it also, the new world is declared, but it also takes away the way that we've resolved our conflicts up to now, by scapegoating, by driving it out, by blaming the other, by the enemy. In his final years, Girard became convinced that the consequence of this revelation was that two things would happen at once. It would spread greater uncertainty, because it would no longer be possible simply to be certain that we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. But it would also give us at last the possibility of a different kind of community and a different possibility in the world. Up to now, Western liberalism has operated on the assumption that conflict will take us to the answer. Hegel will take us to the answer of the great reconciliation at the end of our conflicts. Girard says, no, if we don't stop this, it's much more like the German military theorist von Clausewitz. One thing leads to another and it escalates. And that we as our world are coming to a point now where it is actually a choice. We either keep escalating this up, or we decide we have to do something different. Nothing reminds you more of the way the gospel describes the choices that we actually have to face here. That we as a globe are coming to a point here now where this is no longer just pious theory. This is no longer just something to do with spirits. This is something to do with the choices that we're increasingly facing in a very dangerous technological world. How do we make our peace? Do we make our peace on a shared enemy? Do we make our peace on a chaotic rivalry when we try to desperately drive out more and more enemies with less and less effect? Or do we try to find a way in which we accept what we're told about ourselves and find a way back to each other as human beings in human relationship? I'm going to stop now, but I suppose I just want to finish with this. The work of René Girard, in this sense, to me, seems to me intensely important. It's important for the church about how we understand what it is that we were given and what it is that we are preaching. It's important, though, for each one of us and how we understand what we might do in our own lives, but it's also important as a tool for understanding some of the really big situations we're in, but also in thinking not just how do we stop this and how do we get involved in the mimetic frenzy, but what actually might reveal the possibility of forgiveness to the face of the victim and allow us a different kind of a peace. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Does that work? Good. Well, Duncan was not exaggerating when he said that I had urged him to go over his time, because I'm always thrilled when I have to say less. As you know, a good Englishman tries to say almost nothing if you can possibly help it. If any of you have watched Foyle's War, does ever watch Foyle's War? You'll notice that the leading actor becomes more and more monosyllabic as the series goes on, until eventually he stops talking at all. This is a brilliant piece of acting. But yeah, never mind. I'd like to fill you in a little bit of personal history here, because it's part of what I hope Duncan and I are doing here together. I first met Duncan. Duncan first met me when we were both 18 at university. And you would hardly guess it now, but one of the things that characterized Duncan at the time was that he had an extremely high, shrill laugh, which he's now withholding.
This is not fair. This is not fair. This is not fair.
It always seemed to me to be very amusing that Duncan and I doing a show together was a completely straight but very gay-sounding Ulster Protestant and a really quite straight-sounding but extremely gay English Catholic priest. It seems to me to be quite a good duo, and and I was really very, very keen that you should hear a Girardian Ulsterman in Boston. So there's been a good deal of machination going on here, because us doing this together and the very fact of what it represents, to me, is part of what this is about. So I think that this is a 3D show, as it were. It's not merely works. And I would like to say, in fairness, that one of the things that the gospel promises us is, if we let go of parents, wives, children, family, lands, etc., etc., we will be given a variety of things: mothers, sisters, brothers, not fathers. The gospel doesn't promise any fathers, which clearly the priesthood was not in the mind of the gospel writer. But as I said, and persecutions as well. But for me, Duncan has been one of the brothers who the gospel has given me, a real privilege and a real brotherly love, which I have learned to appreciate over the years which we've collaborated together. So I want to state that for the record. Where Duncan ended is where I'd like to take us from. He very lucidly gave the major parts of the Girardian picture, as it were. And what we, in a sense, find ourselves living in, as he gestured towards at the end, is what Girard referred to as an extended sacrificial crisis. Now, what he meant by sacrificial crisis in his original elaboration of his hypothesis was that after you've had the all against one ganging up against a particular person or group, this creates unanimity. But in fact, the unanimity only lasts so long. Because of course, it's a fake unanimity. It depends on people actually having agreed to go along with a lie or genuinely believing a lie, that that person really was responsible for the evils caused. And so, after a comparatively short time, the effect of the cult of that particular deity, the memory of that particular scallywag, becomes ineffective. And before long, the group finds itself casting around for someone else, some other group or whatever, to fit the pattern. And the period in between the success of the first, as it were, fake sacrifice, and before they get to the point of committing the second, is what Girard refers to as the sacrificial crisis. It's when everything's falling apart. It's that space beautifully captured in the Yeats poem, which you all know about, the centre not holding, and what is it? The good lack all conviction, and the evil are full of passionate intensity. Yeah, that's the space of the sacrificial crisis. And in a sense, Christianity is the provocation of an unending sacrificial crisis. What the Epistle to the Hebrews realized, and I think that the Epistle to the Hebrews is best read as an analysis of how do we live in a post-sacrificial crisis. Its sense is no more sacrifice, which means no more resolution to any problems. No more fake resolution to any problems. No more saying, stop the world, I want to get off. Let's start all this again. Which, of course, is very often how we, in our more puritanical moods, wish to cope with changes in society. And this means that we're living in a time where there is no resolution to the potentially simmering possibilities of the outbreaks of violence, which is escalating the whole time. And I think that in the political sphere in your country, you're aware of it, as in the political sphere in my own country, the political sphere across Europe. We've just had a razor-thin victory of the Green candidate over the far-right candidate in Austria. I think it was 30,000 votes over 4.5 million casts, something like that, was it? It was extraordinary, but it could just as easily have gone the other way. You are facing a very interesting, to put it politely, 6 months, in which all sorts of attempts by someone who appears to be a very good witch doctor in terms of his ability to wave a magic wand and point at particular groups and then forget he's done it and do it to another group. His talents in that sphere seem vastly to outmatch his somewhat more stodgy, likely democratic oppositor, which is going to mean that the contest is going to be really very, very, what is the word? It's going to be really very frightening, I suspect, for a lot of us. We are living that Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. And one of the things which I think is central for us, those, whether Christian, Jewish, but anyone, is where is authority to be found in the midst of all this? Clearly not in our political institutions, clearly not in our religious institutions, with a small exception for Pope Francis. Everyone appears to agree that he's an exception to the general rule, which is that religious institutions can't be really trusted any longer. And here we are in the former chancery of say no more. But all across, the same will be true of both of our police and our military and so forth. In fact, the signs of war where they happen are not wars that are being gauged symmetrically but asymmetrically. It's the eruption of asymmetrical warfare that can't be dealt with by normal means. The notion that by deporting people you run any less risk of having an outbreak of that sort of asymmetrical war is simply nuts. Just as in my country, the notion that by separating yourself from the European Union, you will somehow stop jihadis coming to England. All the jihadi problems in England are homegrown. I mean, it's nuts, quite literally, this asymmetrical presence. So how, in the midst of that, do we find the space of authority, the one who speaks to us with authority? And I just very, very quickly, because it seems to me that it's well worth us spending more attention on it, is how mimetic our Lord's understanding of what he was teaching in the space leading up to which the crowd then says, well, it says, and when Jesus finished these words, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. Because that's the very end of Matthew chapter 7. That's after 2 chapters of the Sermon on the Mount. And actually, if you read the chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, he's not speaking authoritatively. He's not, putting down decrees, issuing bulls, fatwas, or anything of the sort. It's a series of little pieces of mimetic advice, all of which presuppose a reflexive understanding of the human being. In as far as you do this to someone else, you are in fact doing it to yourself. It's entirely reflexive, as is the only part of the Lord's Prayer which he repeats is, if you forgive others, then you will be forgiven. That's the only part he actually repeats. The God bit, very nice, but seems to be less important. The really important bit is the anthropological insight. As you let go out there, so you will be let go in here. This is not negotiable. I'd just like to bring out just 2 of these little passages, one because Matt liked it yesterday, and another one because I'd like to try it out on you anyhow. But just to point out how easy these passages are to hear, and yet how difficult it is to associate them with our discovering the center of one who has authority, and therefore learning to be able, in the midst of the varied forms of fascination which are around, and which are very great, and very entertaining, and I mean, how much time do I spend reading Daily Kos or Talking Points Mimo and laughing at what the latest absurdity of some party or other is? A complete waste of time. Purely self-indulgent outrage fodder. And I suspect that one way or another we all do this with our different perspectives. It's so much fun being able to sing along with the chorus of the people who've got it right against the others, none of which help us at all, in fact, advance towards discovering who real authority is, but also not only keeping ourselves safe, which we can't ever really do from the currents of mimetic desire, which are sweeping us all up, but learning how at least to begin to extend a hand out towards those in positions even more precarious than ourselves, which is what the gospel seems to urge. So anyhow, let's just look at the strange use of language in this instruction by the Lord. It says, "Judge not that you be not judged." Okay, so that's straightforward mimetic reflexive stuff. "For with the judgment you pronounce you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get." "You've heard it said to the men of old, 'You shall not kill.' And whoever kills shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment." Okay, so anger and murder are the same pattern of desire. "Whoever calls his brother Raka shall be liable to the council, to the Sanhedrin." And you think, why Raka? Why do they leave it in Hebrew or Aramaic? And then the third verse says, the third part says, "And whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be liable to the hell of fire." This is seriously weird. Raka gets you a mini punishment, and you fool, which after all is a pretty minor insult, seems to get a major punishment. What is going on here? I think our Lord is being much more subtle than this. I think that the reason that the word Raka is kept in Aramaic or Hebrew is to remind us of what was really going on in the discussion, which of course was the reverse in the original. In the original, the discussion being in Aramaic, which would have been the language being spoken at the time, Jesus was saying to the people, if you call somebody Raka, which might have been faggot, it might have been son of a bitch, it was that kind of term, you will be liable to judgment from the Sanhedrin, from those people who govern the in-group. Because effectively you're saying he's a son of a bitch, but he's one of our son of a bitches, as it were. But if you call him Morrow, the Greek term for a fool, then you are associating him with the outsider, with someone who isn't in the in-group. In other words, you are throwing him out of your group. Then you will be cast into the hell of fire. So do you see that because our text is in Greek, we have it exactly the wrong way round? And therefore the RSV says, try to say, whoever insults his brother, they even give up, they don't even try to translate the word. But it seems to me that our Lord is understanding perfectly clearly. No, there are in terms of insult, which are seriously grave, and you should be tried before your Supreme Court. But then there are calling people Mexicans and Muslims and trying to build a wall and having them all deported. In doing that, you are doing that to yourself. In other words, the further away you other people, the more completely you have othered yourself. Does that make sense? And I think that it's well worth, strangely, it's completely, once you hear it like that, it's completely obvious, but it's also completely obvious that this is a perennial issue. Or again, another apparently banal or just weird teaching by our Lord. Again, you've heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for that is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one head white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Well, we'll leave aside our Lord's lack of knowledge of the invention of Grecian 2000 for the purpose of changing the colour of hair, but that was not expected to be in his thing. Because we are related to we rate the issue of swearing with using bad words. We completely miss the point of this. Jesus is not at all concerned about our bad language. He's very seriously concerned about our involvement of God with murder. Why? Because the typical form of the oath was, if I do such and such to you, may God do such and such to me. You may even remember that from the very beginning of the Hebrew Scriptures in the book of Genesis. The first covenant is Abraham, who's instructed to cut some birds in half, and then this flaming torch goes between them. And the form of the oath, this is the Lord saying, if I do not keep my word to you, may this be done to me. Which is why, of course, that covenant is prefigurative of Christ's death, because that was exactly, of course, what was to happen to him. But being, as it were, going through the cut birds and beasts was, may I be killed. In other words, it's an invocation of a murderous force as a divine guarantor, or something which we are completely familiar with, using God as a satanic power source. So then he says, let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything else comes from evil. In other words, if you're trying to boost your case by invoking God, then it is Satan you are invoking. If speaking out of freedom and standing up as a daughter or son of God, you are not able to say yes or no, better not to say anything at all. But don't we live in a world in which the satanic use of God is part of our everyday political agenda? And I'm satanic in the strict sense of the word. An alternative source of power that somehow adds to my credibility by my using it. This makes me it sounds as though I'm making God my instrument, but it's making me an instrument of a satanic God. It's exactly the reverse of what we think we're doing with it. Anyhow, I bring those up simply because in the guise of apparently banal and somewhat bizarre statements, our Lord is giving us very, very clear mimetic advice about how, as it were, to keep our peace in the midst of this crisis. And you'll remember that, at least in the form in which it takes in St. Mark's Gospel, at the very end, when he's standing with his disciples before Jerusalem and they've been telling him how great the temple looks, he says, yeah, the washing company did a great job. But he said, but none of these stones will be left standing on each other. And he tells them to be vigilant. But the vigilance in Mark's Gospel, it says, for you do not know what hour the master will come, whether in the evening or at midnight or at cockcrow or in the morning. But I say to you, this generation will not go away until all these things have come to pass. Okay. And then, in the evening, he hands himself over in the Last Supper. At midnight, Judas hands him over. Judas hands him over. The verb is the same. At cockcrow, Peter betrays him. And in the morning, the Sanhedrin hands him over to the Romans. In each case, it's the same verb. In other words, where is the coming of the Son of Man to be found? Not amidst the glitz and the glory, the things with which you are likely to be easily fascinated, but in the precariousness of one being handed over, betrayed, denied. But the important thing was that initially there was an act of generosity. He was giving himself over. The first use of paradoke, the giving himself, the transmitting himself over, was the positive one of him handing himself over to them. And then the others were, if you like, variations on the theme. Of course, violent and awful variations on the theme. One wonders then whether there is a hint as to what might have been meant earlier in St. Matthew when he says, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house upon the rock, and the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat upon that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine, that's the little slightly banal sounding mimetic comments of the sort that we've been looking at, and does not do them will be like the foolish man who built his house upon the sand, and the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall thereof. In other words, all that fascination leading to solid seeming things is completely permeable by the currents of mimetic desire. And it's only those of us who are invited to practice these very, very small steps. Learning, I think there's a beautiful phrase which Duncan was talking about, learning a certain affection towards the enemies without Stockholm syndrome, as it were. Is that a fair? And for me, at least, as a gay priest in the church, learning a fair amount of affection for certain of il nostri iarchi is especially so many closeted ones, is a question of learning precisely that, affection without Stockholm syndrome. It's too easy to be caught up into being overly concerned, overly, as it were, still a prisoner to their influence, which is not a way of standing up gently, but without the ability to regard them with affection and actually see a brother in the making, as you say there. None of this is worth anything at all because there is no future. Anyhow, I leave it there and we can all take it further, but I hope you see that the question of how we are to hear the voice of our master. He says, "My sheep hear my voice, they'll know who it is." But we have a hell of a tough task to do with the rising tides and the winds blowing and the forms of fascination and violence and fear all going really. We have a tough time, I think, to try and have our fascination moved towards those who are being betrayed, those who are being denied, those whose precariousness is not fascinating, and seeing if by doing so we find ourselves standing up on a rock in the midst of this torment going about us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, James. Now we're going to take some questions, and we've actually thought to give you cards on which you could write the questions down. I think some people who are helping us here are going to distribute these cards with a pen. But while they're doing that, is there anyone brave enough to stand up and shout a question? So that we can get the ball rolling while they distribute the cards and the pens. Is there anyone who would like to? Yes, please, the gentleman in the second row.
Do you want to?
Live in a country. Would you?
Do you want?
Yes,
I think so. People behind you can hear you.
Here you are.
Here we are.
We live in a country where the 1% loan money to the 99%, and the 99% can never really pay back. And so 43% of their income is on their housing, 10% is paying back debts, 15% is paying taxes, and so forth and so on. And it sets up this background for the awful situation we have in the United States and around the world. So I was just wondering, how do we think about this situation in Girardian terms?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to say anything about that first? Right? I will try, but have a go.
I'll try.
Have a go.
Yep.
Have a go.
Well, of course, you're quite right in your analysis of the economy, the economic superstructure of the United States. I think, though, that the radical quality of Girard's insight lies in this. We all belong to the 100% who are engaged in mimetic rivalry and scapegoating. And so the question is, foremost, I think, how are we as individuals, how am I, complicit in this system? And that if I skip that step and immediately begin to ask, who's doing the scapegoating? I actually inadvertently reveal it is me. Right. That, I think, is the way in which Girard's theory is both prior to and post the political deliberation that's involved with, okay, how do we actually practically affect a more just economic system?
I'm going to say something which is, to me, challenging to me as well, I have to say. First of all, I think we have to get out of the notion, which is that this is somehow some kind of guaranteed successful, effective strategy in politics. Jesus was not a successful strategy in politics. And there isn't a miraculous wand that comes up here which goes, this is how we're going to do it and that's how it's going to be done. Although there might be important and interesting strategic things to do in politics about that situation. Okay? Number one. Number two. It strikes me that, and I'll give two examples that are in my head but when I come to the end of this, that What you said, the terrible predicament of people who are stuck in a kind of a slavery system and is happening around us. And that what Jesus does is, well, actually, I'll try and try this. There's a serious risk that what we do is just get angry, escalate against them, all identify that these are the bad guys, try to stick them behind bars or whatever you want to do with them, torture them possibly, make them pay, take all their money and throw it out, and actually in the process become exactly as they are, in the sense of simply repeating the violence that we so abhor with great delight because they so deserve it. These people so deserve it. So the Girardian analysis would say, be very, very, very careful, because I feel it as I'm speaking. I can feel it as I'm speaking, when you get that great feeling of, they so deserve it. Because at one level it might be true, and another level we're doing it to ourselves. So that's number one. Number two, Jesus doesn't say just don't do anything about it then. It strikes me that Jesus' position in the world, how he is with this, what the effect of this is to do is to reveal. The core question is, how is this made, how is the truth of what you say made visible? And it will be made less visible the more alike we are, the more violent we are with it. So Jesus' unbelievable thing in the world is to reveal, and actually to disarm it. Because once it's revealed and once it's clear that that is what is happening, going on with it has already become more difficult. But it also simultaneously risks provoking it, because there will be a huge reaction for people who have something to hide. There's very likely to be just to try to pretend, to try to make sure this isn't the way. The person who strikes me as personally, this is a personal person I watch who's been in politics, who's done this in the United States most effectively, of course, is Martin Luther King. King's approach was of course, outraged at what was happening to his people, the people around him across the US, arising out of a deep history. The absolutely understandable response would have been, at one level, to have gone into some kind of massively violent reaction, and it's still a possibility. And the miracle that we were given for me by King, which I still live out of, was that he didn't go that way. He affected, but he did reveal. And there was a massive cost, and it still hasn't fully transformed, and we still live with all these things. So we live in the reality of the messiness. So I don't want to offer you some kind of magic solution here, but I do want to say that what James was talking about, something of, I see these people and their suffering, and we have to do something about it. The big question then is not just what do we do, but how do we do it? The really big challenge to us all is, and it's, I think, particularly for those of us in the church who say, and I think that is actually where the authority that James referred to of Francis actually has come from for me, is he has stopped preaching from here and started doing from here. And the transformational effect of that is not yet that the world has become great. I mean, Europe has not become better about migrants because he went to Greece and picked up a family of 12 people and took them to Rome. It has not got visibly any better since then. And nevertheless, he's put into our conscience, these Muslim people from Syria are where Jesus is. They're not in the Christian nations of Europe. And somewhere along, we know that. So my answer to you is not, I haven't got a recipe. I've got to say to you what it's that somehow or other, and it's exactly the same for where I live in Ireland. The challenge to us is for me is, how do we stick faithfully to the keeping saying, this is the truth of what is happening here. This is what is happening here, without threatening them with Satan back, but in a sense, provoking Satan almost to do his worst at some level or other. Now, that is not an answer, but I hope that it says, it's for me how I understand the challenge that Girard and the Gospel gives us back. We're not out of this. we're part of this. And these two, even these people who are doing these things are our brothers and sisters. And our question is, how do we make that community more real and more possible? So that's my only answer.
Yes, could I just wait? Did I see some roving mics? Yes, thank you. Would you come forward?
May I have a go at that? Because I think it's I think that's a hugely important question. And one of the things I'd like to indicate is that the Colloquium on Violence and Religion, which is the group of Girardisti, if you like, from many different disciplines and areas of life, have chosen through their cover, through their annual meetings, to focus on debt as the next, as the topic. I think there's a 5-year study project on that. In other words, I think you're absolutely right that this is going to be a central issue for how we stretch Girard's thought into an area that was of no particular interest to him. There are already signs of it at work in the thought of people like Paul Dumouchel, whose book I have here called The Barren Sacrifice. His brilliant insight is how, with the gradual Christian revelation produced collapse of hot solidarity amongst societies, which has been at work since the end of the classical period and through the Middle Ages, and the beginnings of liberalism, individualism, and all that. You also get something entirely new, which would have been unthinkable in the ancient world, which is the growth of indifference. And that, if you like, indifference has become the moral shape of how the victimary mechanism works as the sacrificial crisis wears down. And I think that's a very, very powerful insight, and one that we need to explore more. Jean-Pierre Dupuy, from a more economic point of view, explores the same. A second point, I think that one of the reasons why this is so fascinating is because, in as far as I can tell, and I'm not a paleontologist, I was reading David Graeber's book. I don't know whether you know David Graeber, anthropologist, Debt, the first 5,000 years. But it's fascinating because, of course, the very first forms of writing that existed were, in fact, forms of accounting, not forms of... They were scratches of accounting. And what that suggests, this is something which Graeber doesn't point out. I mean, he almost gives it away, but he's not Girardian, so it doesn't quite get this, is that one of the things that scratch marks do concerning exchanges is that they permit the possibility of deferred vengeance. So the invention of debt is the invention of the possibility of deferred vengeance. It's one of the reasons why in the remaining archaic, or what we call probably falsely primitive tribes that anthropologists have been able to visit, the protocol around giving back presents when you've been given them is intense, really intense, because there's a terrible risk that if you give back the present too soon, it will be seen as a refusal of the present. And if you give it back a present that's too big or too little, you will be seen as having in somehow... In other words, the social role of gift giving is far from being this act of friendly reciprocity. It's acts of very strongly time-controlled vengeance avoidal at the same time. And that the beginnings of writing is the beginnings of the possibility of time becoming measured for the deferral of vengeance. When we start to think about that as at the roots of the history, one of the things that Graeber points out is that debt is a tremendously good thing because we are all always indebted. The notion that debt is a bad thing to be got rid of is a fantasy of a few neoliberal economists and Republican Party politicians. Debt is a tremendously good thing, without which none of us would be anywhere where we are. And just a quick final point on the 1%. and I say this, I hope not too plaintively. I have lived entirely for the last 8 years, thanks to the generosity, the completely disinterested generosity of a member of your 1%, who has never, with whom I disagree on many subjects, and who has never once attempted any form of intellectual control of anything that I say or do. And I suspect also that one of the geniuses of the American system has been a very wise use of the philanthropical exceptions. I suspect that much of what we see here is thanks to donations from people who probably disagree profoundly with a good deal of what is being said right now. Being said right now. Is that a fair? Is that a fair point? Yeah. So yes, we have a real problem here, and it really does need to be studied. But anything that is a whipping up of the tumbrils and leading to Madame Lafarge and her is probably not going to teach us very much about the real issues that we have to face. Even though it looks fun to have heads rolling, as it were.
Thank you. Fred's incisive questions certainly brought forth a lot of thoughtful responses. I'd like to build for a moment on just one of them with a new question, and that is this. It's very clear from the panel that the Girardisti do not advocate a method, but there may be something else. I would call it a mirror. And I'm going to give you 2 very quick examples of the mirror in action. The first is your own. What the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. showed us in America on primetime TV with Bull Connor and the whips and the dogs was ourselves. And we did not like what we saw. If this is what it meant to have white supremacy in the South, Jim Crow, then this had to go. That's a very effective use of the mirror. That's an historical example. The second example is much closer to home because it happened right here in Boston and it happened recently. A very great, just departed Jesuit, Father Ray, and I mediated the great conflicts between the Jewish and the Muslim communities here in Boston about the construction of the Roxbury Mosque. And mediation normally starts out with very cold versions of how do you do? And it doesn't go very far. We encouraged both groups of leaders in the 2 communities to say what they really felt. And it didn't take very long before each of them was literally pointing their finger and yelling. And it takes a while. It takes well over half an hour for people to run out of breath when they get worked up and they're yelling. And they were yelling. And when they finally ran out of breath, the thing that hit each of them on both sides of this horrendous divide was that the other side was yelling, "We're the victims."
Oh, yeah.
And of course, the question hit them in their own heart. Now, how can you be the victims?
Yep.
We are.
Victims. That's what I would call the mirroring effect. And once people recognize that, things change. All the litigation was dismissed. The 2 communities reconciled enough to both be present at the dedication of the Roxbury Mosque when it finished. This was a rare success story. And so my question to you is just how far would Girard take this, as I call it, mirror, and what would he do with it? Thank you.
All of these questions are so incredibly good and complicated. So let me just say a question of saying something to try to encourage all of you to think about these things as well, because this isn't the answer.
Excuse me, down the back, can you hear Duncan?
Okay.
Not very well.
I'll try. I do wave my head about. It's a bit of a personal problem.
Give them your laugh.
Please. No, my high laugh. You have no idea. When I met you, my voice had not broken. I was 18, and every single conversation began with people not speaking to me, but me seeing them say, "Is that a boy or a girl?"
He was about as tall as he is now.
No, I wasn't actually. I was 5'7" when I went to university, and they thought I was one of the most pretty girls who'd ever come into this all-male college. So let me just say that. Anyway, it's all changed now, but I still wave my head about. Let me just say a couple of things about this. I live in a society in which everybody thinks they're the victim. In Northern Ireland, the pattern of our reality is, I only do to you because otherwise you would do to me. I don't want these great laws if I'm Protestant. I don't want these great laws to try to protect myself against the IRA, but basically they're trying to destroy us, and we have to do something about this. I don't want to be a terrorist, but I have to be, because actually I can't make my way through politics here. And actually, as we have gone through our peace process, it is extremely clear that the biggest obstacle to the future is the past. That the most difficult thing for us to be able to imagine a future is that everything about the past tells us that we can't trust them, that they are still this way, and that anybody who thinks that we can is actually slightly mad. And that the best way to political power is to remind people of how bad they really were, and to stick with that reality, because actually, if that's the reality, safety first tells me I'd better protect myself. So part of this is deeply known to me. The second thing is, and I really struggle with this in my own society, is this question of, so what is it that might make possible that this is a totally romantic lie? It is not good people against bad people. It is fallen, difficult people taking, in my view, terrible choices, and nevertheless we fall back into the same loop again. So the really big question, to make the circle stop, that we haven't, to be fair, to be honest with you, found our way through this, so we're working through this, is, but it's a kind of a burning obsession of my own, is how and in what way, without it being simply a violent, there you go. Because there's loads of TV programs every day which tell you this guy did this one did, so we've seen it all, we all know it. That, how do we reveal? And the critical question of, to be honest with you, I think this goes to the heart of Jesus' saying, you know, the blind will see. The obsessional reality in the Bible is about deaf hearing and blind seeing and being it we know. And what is it that we have to see? We have to see that everything we say about them is also true about us. We were talking there about debt, and I I'm Presbyterian still. And, sorry to say that in Boston College, but it's true. And in Scotland, unsurprisingly, the version of the Lord's Prayer that they say is, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors," which is a good Scottish way of putting it. We've always been concerned about debts. But it's the reciprocal nature of that which just to go back to the original question, it's the reciprocal nature of that. It's the reminding, it always brings to mind the story of the forgiven servant, you know, that it is only when we see that we too are debtors, and that we are much bigger debtors, that we can release ourselves from this. I am absolutely sure that one of the ways which we have found is actually sometimes, for whatever reason, and it's usually not straightforward, it's usually that way, and you as a mediator will know this, a story takes hold in which people stop hearing about the labels and they start seeing the person on the other side. The victim becomes visible as a human face to the person in the room. And it's the same thing with the rich and poor thing, is how do we bring the faces of the people who are suffering into the middle of the room in such a way that we cannot deny it. We cannot deny it. Because not their humanity, but our humanity depends on it. And the critical experience for me is not that we do this out of charity because we think it would be good for us to help the poor. But you know something? I, as part of the wealthy, are very high. I don't think I'm 1%, but I'm not that far below. As all of us are here in this room, to be totally honest with you. I need saved, not them. And the habit we have to learn is, who is it I have to go to that will bring me back to humanity, not them back into humanity? Because they are already knowing what dependence on each other is about. So part of that, to be honest with you, is story. In human terms, for me, story becomes really, really important. How do we hear stories? I suppose in the Old Testament, the one that always strikes me is David and Uriah and Bathsheba and Nathan the prophet. That the critical role of Nathan is not to go and say, "Here, I've caught you, I know what you're doing," because he would have been hanged. It is to get, or I don't know what they did in those days, but it was to tell a story in such a way that the listener had to identify with the story and then to be told, aha, but if we put your story into that and we see ourselves, and it becomes visible. And all of a sudden it's disarmed. And all of a sudden I simply have to submit. I simply have to submit to the victim. Now, I'll stop now, but Emmanuel Levinas, the Jewish philosopher, is really, really clear about this. He says that the face of the suffering other, the humanity of the suffering other, when it enters us, we as human beings mimetically have no choice but to enter into relationship with that. That is what Jesus is doing with us. He is bringing something which, if it ever penetrates us, we cannot resist it, if you like, captures us. And so for me, that is always, and I suppose I'm always looking for that, listening for that, hoping for that, trying to wait for that, to see what that looks like.
Thank you.
Yes, one of the accusations that's sometimes made about Girard's thought is that it sounds paranoid, because it's all to do with an all against one. And there's one sense in which I want to agree with that. I think it's a beautiful illustration of the structure of paranoia. It's a beautiful illustration of the way in which our belief that the other is out to get us works. And that it's by learning more, as I've done over the last, however many years that I've been trying to learn from this with lamentably little effect on my personal life, the more I'm able to detect my own paranoia at work. And the more you're able to detect your own paranoia at work, the less you know in advance about them, and the more chance that you might just actually learn something. Which is why I think that it's hugely important, simply the basic question of how do we as human groups learn what is new and true about ourselves and each other. Now, I'll give an example, because this is one of the things, as you know, I mean, it's now happily no longer necessarily the case, but for quite a long time, gay people or certain gay militants played the victim drum. It seems to be far less necessary now. To be honest, the last time I spoke on this university, on the floor of this university, was the evening your Supreme Court legalized gay marriage in 2004. And look how far we've come since then. Okay, so I and people like me really have no excuse for victimry bleating. A friend of mine, a bishop, recently was called to the Vatican, not least in part because he has a gay pastoral group in his diocese, and so they wanted to rake him over the coals in the usual way. And he, to his misfortune, had read me, and and had therefore, since he had some scientific training, was aware of my bizarre claim, which is that being gay is a non-pathological minority variant in the human condition rather than some form of objective disorder. And being a sensible bishop, he said, well, I won't believe it because James said it, because James is, after all, self-interested. So he consulted scientists in his diocese. And they all told him the same thing. They said, yeah, like, yeah. It was all a bit obvious. So, armed with this barrage of scientific backing, he faced his inquisitors and said to them, well, listen, I mean, it seems to be pacifically accepted amongst the scientific community that here we're dealing with a non-pathological minority variant in the human condition. And they said, oh, no, Father. Oh, no. Do not allow yourself to be fooled. The science has been adulterated by a very powerful gay lobby. What you had there is terrified people holding to a conspiracy theory, literally as a conspiracy theory, out of fear, because it's a way of saying we can't have rational discussion about this because there's a wicked they who's doing this. Now, how, in one sense, he was holding up a mirror to them and just saying, is a question possible? And of course, dare one say it, a number of those who were speaking to him were themselves, let us say, not far from amity with Dorothy themselves. So it was a certain mirror that he was holding on. But how does one unfrighten the scandalized? How does one avoid scandalizing the brethren of weak faith, which is one of the things which St. Paul tells us? So the ability, I think, and this is a very important point, to be able to detect conspiracy theory, our own, when at all possible, and others, and rather than play to it, because it's easy enough to wind people up in their conspiracy theories. Any of us, it's quite fun playing to people's stereotypes, but actually to see them as trapped and as frightened and as sad, and how do we help such people move out of that? Well, that involves a very great deal of, dare I say, mimetic subtlety, because it involves precisely not entering into any of the obvious games. And I'm not sure I'm not a good enough practitioner. This is one of the reasons I love hearing about how this works in examples that have nothing to do, well, nothing to do with me. I'm a Briton, I'm responsible for the whole
I deeply feel
show.
actually we'll be theorizing about this until somebody has to say, okay, I have to find a way to say this. This won't work for as long as I preach about it. It'll only work when I know it in reality. It is when somebody comes to me and it's not scary. It didn't turn out to be scary. I mean, the story you told yesterday, I think, which is quite it's in Jonathan Sacks' book about the, after the Paris shootings by one last year, where they moved into the Jewish supermarket. And, but one of the people working in the Jewish supermarket was a young guy from Mali who simply took the people out the back, locked them away until it was too late, it was okay, and then made sure that they got out safely. And of course, in symbolic terms, for those people, the way which stopped them being frightened of it, that all Muslims are coming to get me, was what that young boy did. It was something extremely simple. It was, and who are the witnesses now that all Muslims are not out to kill all Jews? It is those very people who were stuck in a fridge at the back of a raid because they know it wasn't just the one, it was the other. And that story is critical to keeping a whole group of people from being so frightened by what they experience, with absolute legitimacy, by the way. So paranoia sometimes, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. That's right. I mean, part of the part of the problem, I talk about that as living as I do in a paranoid society. I live entirely in a paranoid society, which is that just in case, we better keep our own paramilitaries. We'll keep them hidden away a bit now, and they're a bit more hidden than they were, but we better just keep them because you never know when it'll come in useful and whether you'll need them again. So the only way around that is not somebody standing out saying you're very stupid and it's not very good, because actually when you're frightened, being told not to be frightened doesn't actually work.
Right.
What works is an experience which makes you realize your fear is not necessary. what the angel says to the shepherds, be not afraid, is unbelievable for people meeting God. It is totally, totally impossible to imagine meeting God and God says to you, be not afraid. The revolution in the middle of that sentence to me is unbelievable. And we never hear it. Be not afraid. That is such a revolution in the nature of who God is. If you're sitting, in the way the story is told as shepherds in the field, and all of a sudden there's all these angels host, and he says, don't be afraid, and they go, aye, don't be stupid. Well, not be afraid, I think it'd be a good idea. But be not afraid. This is good tidings of great joy. This is a possibility out of it. And I really do think that speaking into this, that experience is the only thing that makes a difference. And the question of the gospel is, in the face of this murder, there's something beyond this, and we are offered a new possibility. Now, the big question is not, to be honest with you, is there the violence and the fear around? The really big question is, do we believe? Do we believe? Do we live out of the faith? And that's not just a mental thing, it's a physical thing. Do we live out of the faith that we do not need to be afraid? We do not. So when you're speaking to your people about the wealth, you don't have to be afraid of their big wealth. You just simply say, this can't go on. This cannot go on. And we all know it.
I think I'm going to have to move this on a little bit. We may have time for just one more question.
Yes.
I'd like to ask, particularly James, for you to respond to this question. One of the texts that I really struggle with in the context of Girardian thought is Matthew 10:16 to 23. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about.
There's a test now for you. So, what does it mean?
Wise as serpents, innocent as doves. So I'll read it to you. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Am I reading the right? Yeah. Beware of men. I'm reading, a sexist translation. This is the RSV, excuse me. For they will deliver you up to councils and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake to bear testimony before them and the Gentiles. When they deliver up, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say. For what you are to say will be given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will deliver up brother to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will all be hated, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But he who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next, for truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Oh, I think it's a wonderful passage, he says flippantly. No, I think that one of the things that it shows is that Jesus understands exactly what is going to come about because of his death. Every generation will have to fight to hold its world together. And each group will be seen to be a traitor to the holding together of the world, because it will have become evident how the world is being held together by fake sacrificial rites. So children will be seen to be, transgressive. But in fact, yes, of course, because each generation is seeing through the sacrificial remnants of the previous. So he's saying, this is the process that's going on, and by God, does it go on? I mean, this is the experience of many of us. It's one of the, if you like, dare I say it, one of the, I think, the missed opportunities in Amoris Laetitia, in the Bible passage at the beginning, was that he really doesn't give much time to the more difficult passages about family. He tends to give the very positive view of family. But there's no question at all that Jesus gives the very realistic picture of family that the Pope then seeks to help us be attentive to towards the end of that document. But precisely this, he's aware that as a sacrificial order collapses, everyone will be seen to be a traitor to the previous picture of what it will look like. In other words, that what Christianity brings into the world is constant, ongoing cultural treachery. And I think that that's hugely important. But, and what does he say in the midst of this? In the midst of this, he says, don't be paranoid. And I think that this is one of the most marvelous things. I mean, if you're an egomaniac like me or whatever, of course you have ideas of yourself being in a grand trial and people hurling accusations against you, and I think I'm told that other people have these fantasies as well, and that I'm not alone in this. And Jesus is saying, don't do that. I mean, in as far as you're doing that, you haven't found the rock. Let go of that. In as far as you cease to be run by the fear of that, and therefore playing tit for tat with it and wanting to defend yourself and be found righteous amidst them all. In as far as you play that game, you're part of it. It's only when you don't need to defend yourself, you don't need to justify yourself in the midst of that, that you will actually not have to prepare for what to say, because your very demeanor, and maybe just occasionally, but not always necessarily, some words, will in fact reveal the truth in the midst of what's going on. They may not even be able to notice or hear what's being said. But you will have stopped playing the game. You will be aware that the accuser of the brethren has been cast down, to use the term of the book of Revelation, who accused them day and night before God. In other words, the accusing voice, that's the voice of the lynch mob. It will grind on and on. You're dead to all that. You have died with Christ. You don't need any longer. Because you're pre-dead, you don't need to listen to the... After all, that's what baptism is, saying be pre-dead. If you have pre-washed genes, you have pre-dead humans. But that, as far as I can see, it's very much the same sense. But what's astounding to me was that Jesus in Matthew's Gospel is quite clear of the generational knock-on effect of how this would work. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Look, thank you all very much. I think I suggest now that we continue these discussions over a cup of whatever it is that's waiting for us. Thank you very much, Sarah.